We're going to get started on our next project, and this project we're going to approach a little bit different. We're going to start the Marble project, and we're going to get started by building kind of a sandbox level that's going to allow us to explore our mechanics. So we're going to start with some basic mechanics first, and then we're going to decide how we can design levels around these core concepts. So in order to get this project started, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create in Unity a new project. So inside Unity, I'm going to choose File, New Project. I'm going to set the location to an appropriate location. So I'm just going to jump out. I have a game design folder, and inside my game design folder, I have a class folder. Once I choose my class folder, I'm going to call this Marble Game, and I'm going to save that in an appropriate location. I'll hit save. Now, in order to get this project started, I have a lot of different packages I can get started with. I'm going to grab a couple that I know that I'm going to use. The character controller always comes in handy. I definitely want to utilize some particles at some point. And again, if we miss some of these packages, we can always go back and import them into the project later. So I'm going to go through and pick a few of these. Definitely want particles and physic materials. I'm definitely going to leverage the skyboxes. I'm not going to use any mobile assets at this point. I'll probably end up using some kind of really simple basic terrain, so I'll load the terrain object in. And I'm just scanning here. I'll probably want to use some water. And I'm just looking through, and I'm seeing a couple of different assets that are popping up that I've downloaded and imported once before. I'm seeing my Playmaker package here, so I'm going to check that because I definitely want Playmaker. Now, if you don't have Playmaker listed in this list, you can always load it manually the same way we did in our previous project. So you can either download it from the asset store once you create your project, or you can import the package. So I'm just going to scan these. I don't see anything else that jumps out at me. Oh, there is the terrain asset. So I have a couple different terrain assets. I have one terrain asset listed up here. This is the default terrain assets that comes with Unity, and I suspect that the second instance is the terrain asset package that I downloaded from the asset store from Unity. So again, if I've missed any of these things, and some of these things I may not use, I'll make those decisions a little bit later. So I'm going to create this project, and it'll take a minute for that project to build. And I always like to, until I gain confidence with the project that I'm working on, I always like to go into my project folder and just confirm that I created this project in the right location. So I'm going to go into my game design folder. I'm going to go into my class folder. I can see my Marble Game, and in fact, that's still being built. When I look inside the Marble Game project, these are all of the assets that Unity has built for me. Now, I'm going to add to some of these folders here a little bit later through Unity. But remember, the assets folder, this is the thing that we see in our project folder inside Unity. So Unity is still doing its thing behind the scenes. I can see it's working. It's bouncing in my system dock and showing me a little progress wheel here. So once this is done and everything is imported, I'll be ready to start the project. But for the sake of the demo, I'm going to pause this. Unity do its thing. So through the magic of a little in-camera editing, we saved ourselves some time there with the project creation. So again, when I look through my assets folder inside Unity, what I'm looking at is I'm looking at the assets folder inside the project that I just created. So I'm looking at assets. So just a little reminder about that. Now, again, I have Playmaker set up by default. So I'm looking at my Playmaker editor window. I'm also looking at my inspector and my action browser. I might change this around a little bit later to take better advantage of my screen real estate. But for now, I want to get this basic project set up. It's always a good practice to save your scene right off the bat, but I'm going to make a few changes before I save my scene. I want to create a ground plane, and I'm not going to use a terrain object this time around. I'm just going to use a simple cube. I'm going to get started with the cube, and as I create assets, I'm going to make sure that I name these. So I'm going to call this ground. That's my ground cube, and I'm going to change the size from 1 along the X. I'm going to change it to 100. I'm going to leave it set to 1 along the Y, and I'm going to bump the Z axis up to 100. So I have a 100 square cube with a height of 1, and that'll give me the ground plane that I'm looking for. Now I'm going to move this down just a little bit. I'll send this down on the Y axis. I'll send this down to -1. Just move it down just a little bit. And the reason I did that is that I'm going to create another game object, and this is just a little object for scale and to get our lighting set up, I'm going to create a cube. With that cube selected, I see that the object came in at kind of a funny position here. So I'm just going to reset the object position. There we go. Now it's at 0, 0, 0 in my world space. I'm going to double click on that cube just to zoom in. And I can see that the way that I've set this up, I'll just move that down a little bit to confirm this. Because I've sent that ground plane to -1, any object that I create, the surface of my ground is actually, it's going to be about -0.5. Okay, and so what I mean by -0.5 here is that if I look at my ground, the object is selected. Its pivot point is right in the center of this object. This object has a height of 1, so its pivot point is directly in the center at 0.5 of the object, or half of the object. Same thing with my cube. And basically, if I arrange my ground plane in this current setup at -1 according to the Y, if I make a default cube, that cube is going to sit right on the surface of my ground plane. Now, if I create another object, I'll just create a real quick cube, and I'll set this cube off to the side. If I change the scale of Y to 2, you can see that I push that cube down through the floor. I can see from this wireframe preview, I can see my collider is through the floor. But if I move this up, say to 0.5, that object is lining right up with the ground. Now, that's not too important when it comes to the player object, but it is important to understand where your objects are in space. So my ground plane is at the point where if I create an object, I'll just create other and I'll create a sphere. And as long as my object is at the default scale, it's sitting right on the surface of my ground plane. So that might come in handy. So I got a few objects that are inside my scene, and I want to start to think about some basic aesthetics. Before I start playing with mechanics, I want to just make a real quick pass and set up the lighting inside my scene. Now, I haven't saved my scene yet, so I'll do a quick file, save scene, and this is going to be level 1. So I'm going to call this LVL01 and save that directly in the assets. Now I see my scene project. In this project, we're going to have a loading scene, and we're going to have multiple levels in this game, so that when we successfully complete one level, we move to the next. And we'll talk a little bit about persistence in terms of score and other variables. But for now, I just want to make a real quick pass at some of the basic aesthetics and explore some of the other concepts in Unity that we didn't talk about in the previous project. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a real quick pass with lighting. And I want to set up a simple complementary light system. I'm going to do that by choosing game object, and I'm going to create 2 directional lights. So I'll create my first directional light. Now, the way that this directional light is projecting is it's projecting along its z-axis. So if we look at the blue arrow, that's the direction that the light is coming from. Now, I suggest that whenever you set up a game, we're always looking down the z-axis. So I'm going to orbit. I'm going to change my orbit, and I'm paying attention to this widget in the top right-hand corner. I'm going to orbit. I'm option clicking, dragging, and orbiting so that I'm looking roughly down the z-axis, okay? And the reason I like to orient this way is that's because my vertical axis is still y, my left and right axis is essentially the x-axis, okay? And the foreground background space is the z-axis, and that's typically how 3D environments are set up. The y is the up axis, the left-right axis is x, and the foreground background axis is z. So in order to kind of further demonstrate this point, if I grab one of my cubes that are inside my scene just temporarily, just so I can set up some lighting, if I'm looking in the direction of the blue axis, the blue arrow, that's its forward direction. Okay, so if I take this cube and I move it back in space, you can see that on the transform component, I'm moving that in the positive z. That's the positive z direction that I'm moving this cube, and I can see that its transform position is increasing. So I'm looking down the z-axis. I'll orient my camera to make sure I'm looking generally in terms of the z-axis, and ultimately we're going to control the camera in a 3-dimensional space and start moving around, but it is important to get oriented in our space. Back to our directional light. So I have my directional light selected. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to zero out the rotation of my light just for a moment, so I have a better sense of what this light is going to look like. So I've just zeroed out the rotation. I've changed its default rotation. And now this light source now is coming directly from the side or down the z-axis. And so what I want to do is I want this light to kind of be coming from the top left-hand side, roughly, or top right-hand side. I just need to be mindful of one of the directions because I want to complement this light by having a primary light source and then sort of a fill light. So I'm going to treat this directional light as my sun or my moon or my primary illumination. And so what I'll do is I'm going to rotate along the y-axis just a little bit. And I'm watching really just for that blue axis to really kind of be pointing at a diagonal to the face. That looks pretty good. And now I'm going to rotate it along its x-axis so that the blue axis is pointing down towards the floor. So I'm going to grab the x and I'm going to rotate. Okay, and I'm not paying too close attention as to what the actual values are here, but I'm just kind of visually paying attention to what the blue axis is pointing at. And so that's good for now. Just kind of, so the sun's up here over our shoulder to the left. I'm going to change the color of this light, and I'm going to change it to like an orange, yellow. I'm really going to warm up this light quite a bit, and I'm going to exaggerate this for just a bit until we get our lights really kind of configured. I'm going to take the intensity down just a bit from 0.5 to 0.3. I might bump this back up in just a little bit, but I'm also going to choose shadow types. I'm going to turn on hard shadows. So now I'm casting shadows. I have a fairly warm light inside my scene. It's a little more beige. I kind of wanted this light a little bit more saturated, but for now, for the sake of the demo, I think this is going to look pretty good. Okay, so I'm just orbiting and I'm getting a better sense of what this main light source is doing. I see where it's being cast from. I'm going to change this directional light. I'm going to give this a different title. I could call this key light because it's my primary light. I could call it primary light. I'm simply going to call this sunlight for now. Okay, and I made a mental note that this is in fact my key light or my primary light source. Now what I want to do is I want to kind of fill in these shadows. I want to borrow from this 3-point light strategy, and I want to start to fill in the dark side of the object with a complementary light. So I'm using this kind of yellow-orange light source here. And so I'm going to choose the complement of that color. I'm going to choose something in the blue. So I have my primary light source. I'll create another game object, another directional light. I'm going to choose something in the blue. Okay, I'll ultimately take this intensity down here a bit. Okay, but I'm going to do the same thing I did with the key light, which is I'm going to zero out the X and the Z. Once I zero that out, I can see that I can make a mental note that my light is shining in the Z direction, and so I have a lot of control over this now. I'm going to rotate it along the Z, but I'm going to rotate it so that it's kind of pointing in the opposite direction. So my sunlight is up and over my left shoulder. I want my fill light to be off to my right side. And I still want this pointing towards the ground as well. So I'm going to rotate and point that towards the ground along the x-axis. I'll continue to rotate along the y here a little bit just to kind of change that angle. There we go. That's kind of what I'm looking for. Okay, now I'm going to take the intensity way down. I'll take that down to maybe 2 or maybe 3. 3 feels a little too intense, but that's okay. For the sake of the demo, I'm going to leave it. But right now we have a fairly dynamic light setup. We have a primary light that's coming over our left shoulder that's illuminating the scene. It's the one casting the shadows. And then we have this blue fill light that's coming back into the scene. Now, we can control the intensity of the shadows if we go, remember, our sunlight is the one that's casting our shadows. And we have hard shadows, and I just want to take the strength of those shadows and I can bump those down because we kind of want those to be a little bit more delicate than they are. So I'll just take that down to maybe about 6 for now. That seems pretty good. And I'll just kind of play around with the light source a little bit. I'm changing the intensity of the color. I'll kind of get that dialed in, but that's just going to take a little bit of experimentation. The other thing that I can do is by default there's an ambient light inside Unity. So whenever we create a scene, or a project, we have an ambient light that's inside our environment, and we can't find that in the inspector panel until we go to Edit, Render Settings. And from the Render Settings panel, once we do that, we'll see that in our inspector, we have all these different options. Now, we do have the ability to introduce fog, and I could turn on fog, but I really don't want to do that because this isn't a game that calls for fog. We have fog color, and we have a number of other settings. What I'm interested in doing is I'm interested in modifying the ambient light setup. And right now our ambient light is pretty dark. If I click on that, you can see that it's kind of in this red channel, and it's very close to black. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of send this more towards a blue. I'm going to keep it fairly gray, but as I slide this around, you can see that I'm really kind of changing the ambient light inside the room. So I'm just going to bring that up a little bit, bring the ambient light up, try to, maybe I'll just kind of slide this around to see what kind of results I get. And I'll leave that in the blue for now. And I'll bring that up, I'll close this, and now I'll go back and continue to play with the intensity of my light sources here. So maybe I'll leave that up at 3, but I'll go back to my directional light or my fill light, and I'll take this down maybe to 2, and you can see that I'm really kind of getting some different results. So I have some basic lighting inside my scene. I'll come back and continue to play with that. But the other thing that I want to do is I want to get some basic materials inside my scene just to kind of create a little contrast. So I'm going to go inside my assets. I'm going to right click and create a folder. And in this folder, this is a place where I'm going to create materials. And so I'm just going to call this materials. I'll double click to enter the materials folder. And I want to create just some simple flat colors, just something for the ground, for this sphere that might be the player color, and then for these 2 temporary obstacles that I have inside the scene, just to kind of evaluate materials and lighting. So I'm going to right click, I'm going to choose to create. Now I'm doing this inside my material folder that I just created. I'm going to create, and I'm going to create a material. And from this material, I'm going to name it, it's already highlighted, I'm going to call this player. This will be the player color. With that material selected, I'm going to look in the inspector panel, and I'm going to choose this little swatch here, this little color picker, and I'll just kind of set this to some kind of a red color, right about there for now. And again, these colors are completely up to you how you create these, but I'm just going to drag that and drop that onto my player character. I'm going to create another material, and this is going to be my ground material. And for my ground material, I'll use something that's a little bit closer to kind of a fairly earthy green. There we go. And I'll drag that out onto the ground. I can always change these materials later, so I'm just making a really quick pass at these materials just to get some contrast in the scene. I'll call this obstacle for now. And this obstacle material is going to be something in the blue, right about there. And I can just throw these materials inside the environment. So now when I hit the play button and I'm looking at my scene through my camera, I have this basic setup that's illuminated. The lights are set up. They don't seem as intense once I start throwing some materials inside the equation, but I'm going to continue to kind of tweak some of those values. So let's take a minute and set up our scene. I'm going to do a quick file save scene now that I've made some progress. We'll come back in the next presentation and start to talk about the basic mechanics of our environment. But we'll do that in the next presentation.